Good evening. Imagine the thunder of Tomahawk missiles ripping across the Caribbean sky, the silent glide of Delta Force operators slipping into the heart of Caracas, the sudden, almost cinematic collapse of a government that had seemed unshakable. That was what unfolded on the 3rd of January, and it was not a routine raid or a humanitarian rescue. It was the first direct collision of great powers in a world that no longer revolves around a single pole. It was the opening shot of rehearsal for a war that history will remember not as a regional skirmish, but as the first act of multipolar contest for supremacy. We have lived for decades under the comforting illusion that America stood alone at the apex of global power. The Soviet Union fell. China promised to be content with factories and trade. Russia appeared weak and distracted. In that narrative, the United States could intervene in Iraq, bomb Libya, topple regimes in the Middle East, and the world would grumble, perhaps protest, but ultimately acquiesce. That was unipolarity, a story of hegemony whose reach seemed limitless. The Venezuelan operation shattered that story. The strike was swift, precise, and militarily flawless. American missiles hit their targets. Delta Force seized the president. And within a handful of hours, the Venezuelan state apparatus lay in ruins. By any tactical metric, it was a masterpiece of modern warfare. Yet the strategic calculus was fatally flawed. Washington acted as if the Monroe Doctrine were a living shield, assuming that China and Russia would lodge diplomatic protests and then retreat to their own spheres. It assumed that the great powers would not risk anything beyond words. What happened next proved that assumption disastrously wrong. Beijing responded not with a statement, but with a cascade of economic countermeasures. Chinese corporations halted contracts with American firms. Chinese banks froze dollar transactions worth billions, and within 48 hours, Beijing had imposed targeted sanctions on the United States, a move not seen since the Cold War. Moscow, far from staying quiet, dispatched nuclear-capable submarines and a guided missile cruiser into the Caribbean, positioned them close enough to make every American naval commander think twice about the next move. The Russian Navy's presence was a stark reminder that the United States now faced a rival willing to bring the very instruments of nuclear deterrence to the doorstep of its own hemisphere. The escalation did not stop at ships and sanctions. Within 72 hours, Chinese hackers launched coordinated cyber attacks that knocked out power grids in 3 American states. Hospitals went dark, markets froze, transportation networks stalled. Beijing denied involvement, but the message was unmistakable. The United States could no longer act with impunity, because each action now provoked a multidimensional retaliation. Russia followed suit, announcing joint exercises with Iran in the Strait of Hormuz, threatening oil supplies, and even deploying tactical nuclear weapons to a forward base, a move that blurred the long-standing taboo against placing nuclear arms on the battlefield. The old rules of engagement, once clear in the bipolar era, have evaporated, replaced by a chaotic set of responses that multiply with each American decision. What this cascade reveals is the emergence of a new competition where 3 major powers, America, China, and Russia, vie for dominance, and the risks of miscalculation have become exponentially higher than during the Cold War. The United States finds itself fighting a 3-front war without the resources to sustain it. Its forces are already stretched across a war in Europe, a lingering conflict in the Middle East, and a tense standoff in the Indo-Pacific. Adding a naval presence in the Caribbean to enforce a short-lived operation further thinned its strategic posture, leaving gaps that Beijing and Moscow can now exploit with coordinated pressure. This is classic imperial overstretch, the very phenomenon that Paul Kennedy described when he warned that great powers eventually collapse under the weight of their own ambitions. The United States once could impose sanctions with the confidence that targeted nations had few alternatives. The Venezuelan crisis exposed the limits of that leverage. China now offers an alternative economic partner for nations desperate to escape American pressure. Russia provides military support. Iran supplies energy. The old toolkit of unilateral coercion no longer works in isolation. Whenever Washington deploys boots on the ground or launches missiles from the sea, it triggers a synchronized economic and cyber response that can cripple its own financial system faster than any conventional battle. The financial repercussions have been immediate and profound. The moment Chinese banks began restricting dollar transactions, the American stock market trembled, and global supply chains experienced shocks that rippled through every sector. American companies with deep ties to China saw their share prices plunge as Beijing threatened to revoke licenses and impose punitive regulations. The dollar, long the undisputed reserve currency, faced renewed pressure as countries accelerated efforts to diversify away from reliance on American financial infrastructure. For the first time since the 40s, the United States confronted a coordinated assault on its economic foundations that could outweigh any tactical victory on a battlefield half a world away. Technology has become the new battlefield, and the Venezuelan episode highlighted how underestimated cyber capabilities are reshaping power dynamics. The Chinese attacks were surgical, targeting power grids, financial networks, and transportation systems, while deliberately avoiding direct hits on military installations that might trigger conventional retaliation. This precision shows a level of preparation and strategic foresight that suggests years of hidden preparation, waiting for a political green light to unleash a digital weapon that can paralyze a nation without a single shot being fired. The nuclear dimension adds yet another layer of danger. Russian officials openly discussed the possibility of deploying tactical nuclear weapons to reinforce their strategic messaging, a move that raises the stakes dramatically. By placing these weapons within striking distance of the United States, Moscow forced the Pentagon to divert anti-submarine assets from the Pacific, where they were needed to monitor Chinese naval activity near Taiwan. The coordination between Beijing and Moscow, even if informal, demonstrates how rival powers can create simultaneous crises that strain American resources on multiple fronts. All of this occurs against the backdrop of domestic political pressures that make de-escalation almost impossible. The United States faces an election cycle that rewards decisive, hardline action. The Chinese leadership is consolidating power and needs to showcase strength on the global stage. The Russian administration is grappling with economic hardship at home and seeks foreign policy victories to bolster domestic legitimacy. These internal dynamics lock each leader into a commitment trap, where backing down will be politically ruinous, and escalation becomes a default response. History tells us that such domestic imperatives played a crucial role in the outbreak of the Great War a century ago, when European leaders, bound by nationalist fervor and political survival, could not step back from a crisis that spiraled into a continent-wide conflagration. The Venezuelan crisis mirrors that pattern, but the weapons have changed. Instead of trench warfare, we now have cyber assaults that can black out entire regions, and nuclear posturing that can tip the balance from conventional conflict to existential threat in a matter of hours. International institutions, once the scaffolding that held the Cold War order together, have proven ineffective in this new arena. The United Nations Security Council sits paralyzed by vetoes. NATO debates whether a cyber attack on American infrastructure counts as an attack under Article 5, and financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank have been repurposed as tools of economic warfare rather than engines of global cooperation. The erosion of these mechanisms leaves a vacuum where miscalculation can more easily translate into open conflict. The timeline of escalation has also compressed dramatically. In the Cold War, crises unfolded over months, allowing diplomatic channels to open, back-channel negotiations to take place, and for leaders to step back and reassess. In Venezuela, the sequence from a conventional military strike to a cyber onslaught to nuclear threats played out within 72 hours. Modern communication, rapid deployment capabilities, and the intertwining of economic and cyber tools have accelerated the pace of conflict beyond the capacity of traditional diplomatic institutions to respond effectively. What we are witnessing, then, is not a one-off incident, but the establishment of a dangerous new norm. By using force to maintain regional dominance, the United States has set a precedent that invites retaliation not only in kind, but in kind across multiple domains: military, economic, cyber, and nuclear. Each side tests the resolve and capabilities of its rivals, and each test raises the probability that the next flashpoint will ignite a broader confrontation. The economic fallout is already reshaping global finance, with alternative payment systems emerging to bypass the dollar, energy contracts being renegotiated in non-dollar currencies, and supply chains being rerouted to reduce dependence on any single power. The cyber dimension, too, has been normalized. The attacks on American infrastructure demonstrated that state actors can wield digital weapons as legitimate instruments of statecraft. bypassing the legal and moral constraints that govern conventional warfare. This blurs the line between crime and war, making it easier for nations to inflict massive civilian harm without crossing the threshold that would traditionally trigger a full-scale military response. The nuclear escalation risk is perhaps the most chilling. Russia's decision to position tactical nuclear weapons in proximity to the United States broke an informal taboo that helped keep great power competition from spiraling into nuclear exchange for decades. By signaling a willingness to use nuclear threats as bargaining chips, Moscow has lowered the threshold for nuclear use, creating a new calculus where limited nuclear deployments could be perceived as acceptable escalation tools. All of these developments point to a sobering conclusion. The era of unipolar dominance has ended, and the world has entered a multipolar competition where power is measured not just in tanks and aircraft carriers, but in cyber code, economic leverage, and the strategic placement of nuclear arsenals. The transition from a single hegemon to a contested order is inherently dangerous because it removes the clear hierarchies and established rules that once helped manage rivalry. In this new environment, missteps are amplified, and the cost of error can be catastrophic. We are now at a crossroads. The United States can continue to rely on the old playbook of decisive military action, hoping that superior firepower will deter challengers. Or it can recognize that the strategic landscape has shifted, that each action triggers a cascade of responses across multiple domains, and that the only way to avoid spiraling into a broader conflict is to develop new mechanisms for managing competition, mechanisms that can keep cyber attacks, economic retaliation, and nuclear posturing from becoming the new normal. But the evidence suggests that such mechanisms are unlikely to emerge. Domestic political incentives in Washington, Beijing, and Moscow all favor confrontation over compromise. The institutional framework designed for a bipolar world is inadequate for a multipolar reality. Technological change outpaces diplomatic protocol, and the balance of power continues to shift in ways that encourage revisionist states to challenge the existing order. In this context, the Venezuelan crisis was not an aberration. It was a preview of the future, a glimpse of a world where regional conflicts can explode into global confrontations within hours, where cyber weapons can cripple civilian infrastructure without a single shot being fired, where nuclear threats can be used as diplomatic leverage, and where economic retaliation can erode the very foundations of hegemon's power. The margin for error is shrinking, and the stakes have never been higher. The story we have just begun to tell is one of escalating great power competition, of a United States stretched thin across 3 continents, of China and Russia learning to strike back with tools that bypass traditional military defenses, and of a global order scrambling to keep pace with a new, faster, and far more dangerous form of warfare. As we move forward, we will examine how these dynamics are reshaping alliances, how proxy actors are being pulled into the vortex, and what the likely paths forward look like for a world teetering on the brink of a multipolar war. Stay with me, because the next chapter will delve into the response patterns of the rival powers, the technological and economic weapons they wield, and the domestic forces that are driving each of them toward an ever more confrontational stance. The opening shot has been fired. Now we must understand the whole battlefield. The likely paths forward look like a tangled web of strategic choices, each fraught with peril, and each capable of pulling the world deeper into a conflict that none of the great powers can afford to lose. To understand where we might be headed, we must first dissect the reaction patterns that have already emerged in the wake of the Venezuelan operation, and then explore how those patterns are likely to evolve as the contest for global influence intensifies. China's response to the American strike was not limited to a series of rhetorical condemnations. Within hours, Beijing mobilized a coordinated economic counteroffensive that struck at the very arteries of U.S. financial power. State-owned banks placed immediate restrictions on dollar-denominated transactions involving American firms, effectively freezing billions of dollars of trade in a single move. Chinese corporations announced a halt to all joint ventures with U.S. partners in sectors ranging from aerospace to advanced semiconductors. The message was clear. Any unilateral use of force that threatens Chinese interests will be met with swift and comprehensive economic retaliation that can cripple the aggressor's ability to project power abroad. Moscow, for its part, chose a more kinetic approach. Within a day of the Venezuelan raid, Russian naval forces dispatched a nuclear-capable cruiser and a pair of ballistic missile submarines to the Caribbean, positioning them at the edge of the operational theater to signal a willingness to defend its strategic interests with the most potent weapons at its disposal. Russian officials made public statements warning that any further American encroachment in the Western Hemisphere would be interpreted as a direct challenge to Russian security and would provoke a response that could include the deployment of tactical nuclear assets to forward bases in the region. The Russian move was designed to raise the stakes of any future American intervention, forcing Washington to consider the nuclear dimension before committing forces to another hotspot. Iran's reaction, while less overtly militarized, added another layer of complexity to the emerging multipolar contest. Tehran announced that it would suspend all oil shipments to nations that supported the U.S. action, effectively weaponizing its energy exports as a tool of diplomatic pressure. Iranian-backed militias in the Middle East were instructed to increase their presence in strategic choke points, including the Strait of Hormuz, creating a new set of flashpoints that could be leveraged against any country that attempted to intervene in Latin America. By coupling economic levers with the threat of asymmetric warfare, Iran demonstrated how smaller powers could amplify their influence in a world where great powers are increasingly entangled. The United States, meanwhile, found itself caught in a strategic dilemma. Its traditional playbook of rapid, decisive force projection now carried the risk of triggering a cascade of retaliatory measures that spanned the cyber, economic, and nuclear domains. The American administration, already grappling with a domestic political climate that rewards boldness over prudence, faced pressure from both the Pentagon and congressional leaders to demonstrate resolve. Yet the very tools that once guaranteed American dominance, unrestricted access to global financial markets, the ability to deploy carrier strike groups with impunity, and a network of alliances that could be called upon at a moment's notice, were now being eroded by coordinated actions from Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran. The erosion of the alliance network is perhaps the most unsettling development of all. European capitals, which have long balanced their security commitments to the United States with deepening economic ties to China, have been reluctant to endorse a new wave of sanctions that would further strain their own economies. While some NATO members have expressed verbal support for the American stance, few have been willing to commit concrete military assets to a theater that lies far from the traditional European security perimeter. In the Asia-Pacific, nations such as Japan, South Korea, and Australia have found themselves walking a tightrope, forced away the benefits of American security guarantees against the economic incentives offered by a rapidly expanding Chinese market. The result is a fragmentation of the once cohesive liberal order, leaving the United States with a shrinking pool of reliable partners and an expanding set of adversaries who are increasingly comfortable operating in concert. The role of proxy actors in this emerging multipolar conflict cannot be overstated. The Venezuelan crisis has already demonstrated how local actors can become the focal point of great power competition. In the wake of the American operation, Ukraine offered to dispatch military advisors to assist in stabilizing the newly captured oil fields, a move that would have tied American forces to a conflict with direct implications for the European theater. Israel, leveraging its intelligence capabilities, pledged logistical support, further entangling the Middle Eastern balance of power. On the opposite side, Hezbollah's rhetoric intensified, with the group threatening to open new fronts in Latin America should the United States continue to pursue its aggressive agenda. The proliferation of these proxy engagements creates a cascading effect. Each local flare-up has the potential to draw in additional actors, thereby amplifying the risk of a broader conflagration. Domestic political incentives within each of the three great powers serve to reinforce this dangerous trajectory. In Washington, the incumbent administration faces an election cycle that rewards decisive action, especially against perceived external threats. The political calculus favors a show of strength, even at the cost of long-term strategic stability. In Beijing, the ruling party is navigating a leadership transition that hinges on delivering tangible gains in both economic growth and geopolitical stature. Demonstrating the ability to counter American aggression without resorting to open war provides a narrative of competence and resilience that bolsters the party's legitimacy. In Moscow, the leadership is contending with an economy strained by sanctions and a populace weary of prolonged stagnation. A bold foreign policy that challenges American dominance offers a rallying point for national pride and a means to divert attention from domestic hardships. These internal pressures create what scholars term commitment traps. Leaders become locked into courses of action that are difficult to reverse without appearing weak, and the cost of backing down rises sharply as each successive step deepens the commitment of their respective societies. The Venezuelan episode illustrates this phenomenon perfectly. The United States, having committed a substantial portion of its naval resources to the Caribbean, now faces the prospect of further escalation should it withdraw, while China and Russia have already signaled that any de-escalation would be interpreted as a concession, encouraging rivals to press harder in future engagements. The technological dimension of this new competition adds a layer of volatility that far exceeds the kinetic threats of the 20th century. The cyber attacks launched by Beijing in the immediate aftermath of the Venezuelan strike were not indiscriminate hacks. They were meticulously planned incursions aimed at disabling critical civilian infrastructure, power grids, transportation networks, and financial transaction systems, while deliberately avoiding damage to military installations. By targeting the lifelines of everyday society, the Chinese operation demonstrated capacity to wield digital weapons as a form of strategic coercion that falls outside the traditional frameworks of international law. The ability to inflict widespread disruption without crossing the threshold that would trigger a conventional military response fundamentally reshapes the calculus of deterrence. Russia's deployment of tactical nuclear weapons to forward positions underscores a complementary but equally destabilizing trend. By placing nuclear-capable platforms within striking distance of major American assets, Moscow has effectively lowered the threshold for nuclear use in regional conflicts. The doctrine of escalate to de-escalate, which have been openly discussed in Russian military circles, suggests that the threat of limited nuclear strikes could be employed as a bargaining chip to compel adversaries to back down. This approach creates a precarious environment where misinterpretation or accidental activation could spiral into a full-scale nuclear exchange, something that was largely unthinkable in the bilateral standoff of the Cold War era. Economic retaliation has also taken on a new strategic character. The rapid imposition of targeted sanctions by Beijing, combined with coordinated effort by Moscow to redirect energy supplies away from dollar-based markets, signals a concerted attempt to undermine the financial underpinnings of American power. The dollar, long held as a cornerstone of global trade and finance, now faces credible challenges from a network of state-backed financial instruments designed to bypass the traditional Western banking system. The development of alternative payment mechanisms, such as digital currencies backed by sovereign reserves, threatens to erode the United States' ability to leverage economic coercion as a primary tool of foreign policy. All of these elements, cyber, nuclear, economic, and proxy dynamics, interact in a feedback loop that accelerates the speed at which crises can develop. In the past, the gestation period for major conflicts often stretched across months or even years, providing diplomatic channels with ample time to intervene, negotiate, and de-escalate. Today, the timeline has collapsed to a matter of days, sometimes hours, as illustrated by the rapid succession of events following the Venezuelan incursion. The combination of instantaneous communication, real-time intelligence sharing, and automated response systems means that decisions made in one theater can have immediate ripple effects across the globe, leaving little room for the deliberate, measured deliberation that once served as a buffer against inadvertent war. Given this landscape, the prospects for establishing effective mechanisms of conflict management appear bleak. Traditional arms control agreements, which rely on mutual transparency and verification, are ill-suited to the opaque nature of cyber capabilities and the rapidity of economic weaponization. Existing diplomatic forums, such as the United Nations Security Council, are hamstrung by the veto power wielded by the very states that are most likely to employ these new tools of coercion. Even multilateral institutions designed to foster economic cooperation are being repurposed as instruments of strategic competition, further eroding the trust necessary for collaborative security arrangements. Nonetheless, a few tentative avenues for mitigation can be identified. First, the creation of a cyber norms framework, negotiated among the major powers, could establish red lines that delineate acceptable behavior in the digital domain and provide a basis for attribution and retaliation that are proportionate and calibrated. Second, The development of a multilateral economic resilience coalition, perhaps anchored by a coalition of non-aligned states, could serve as a counterbalance to the use of financial sanctions as a weapon of war, thereby preserving the utility of economic tools for constructive engagement rather than punitive coercion. Third, confidence-building measures that involve the prepositioning of nuclear assets could be formalized through a renewed set of protocols that limit the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons to clearly defined, mutually agreed-upon zones, reducing the risk of accidental escalation. These initiatives will require a fundamental shift in the mindset of the great powers, moving away from a zero-sum perception of security to a recognition that shared stability is a prerequisite for continued pursuit of national interests. Such a transformation is not impossible, but it faces formidable obstacles: entrenched bureaucratic interests, domestic political narratives that equate compromise with weakness, and a strategic calculus that views the exploitation of new domains, cyber, space, financial networks, as low-cost, high-payoff opportunities that sidestep the traditional costs of conventional war. In the final analysis, the Venezuelan crisis stands as a stark illustration of the perils inherent in a world where power is diffused among multiple actors, each equipped with tools that can bypass traditional deterrence mechanisms. The United States, once able to command a global order through a combination of unrivaled military might and economic leverage, now finds itself operating in an environment where any unilateral action can be met with a coordinated, multi-domain response that threatens to outpace its own capacity to respond. The path forward will be defined by how each of the major powers chooses to manage the tension between the desire to assert influence and the imperative to avoid catastrophic escalation. If the United States persists in viewing the world through the lens of unipolar dominance, it will continue to trigger reactions that erode its strategic position, inviting further challenges from China, Russia, and a host of regional actors eager to test the limits of American resolve. Conversely, if Washington embraces a more restrained multilateral approach, one that acknowledges the legitimacy of competing interests and seeks to establish rules for the emerging domains of conflict, it may be possible to carve out a sustainable niche for American power within a more balanced international system. For China and Russia, the calculus is equally complex. Both nations stand to gain from a world in which the United States is forced to either overextend itself or retreat from contested regions. Yet an unchecked escalation that leads to a direct military confrontation would jeopardize their own economic development and risk the very stability they seek to enhance. The strategic challenge for Beijing and Moscow, therefore, is to calibrate their responses in a way that maximizes leverage without crossing thresholds that will precipitate a full-scale war. The role of smaller states and non-aligned actors will also be pivotal. As great power competition intensifies, countries that can position themselves as indispensable intermediaries, whether through providing alternative financial infrastructure, serving as neutral venues for dialogue, or offering critical technological capabilities, will acquire disproportionate influence. The emerging architecture of global finance, with digital currencies and blockchain-based settlement systems, presents an opportunity for such actors to shape the rules of engagement in ways that could either mitigate or amplify the existing tensions. In the short term, we can expect to see a continuation of the pattern set in motion by the Venezuelan episode. The United States is likely to pursue a series of incremental force deployments in regions where perceived strategic vulnerabilities, such as the South China Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Indo-Pacific littorals. Each of these moves will be met with calibrated countermeasures: economic restrictions, cyber intrusions targeting supply chains, and the strategic positioning of conventional and nuclear forces. The feedback loop will become increasingly self-reinforcing as each side interprets the other's actions as proof of an existential threat, thereby justifying further escalation. Mid-term scenarios, however, diverge depending on whether diplomatic innovation can outpace the momentum of competition. One possible trajectory envisions emergence of a new coalition of states committed to a rules-based order that explicitly incorporates cyber, space, and financial dimensions. Such a coalition could develop verification mechanisms for cyber attacks, establish a shared repository of attribution data, and create a multilateral fund to support nations that suffer collateral damage from proxy conflicts. This framework would not eliminate competition, but it could constrain it within a set of mutually accepted boundaries, reducing the probability of inadvertent escalation. A more ominous trajectory envisions a complete breakdown of cooperative mechanisms, leading to a series of overlapping crises that cascade across multiple domains. In this scenario, a localized flashpoint, perhaps a dispute over a contested maritime corridor, could trigger a cyber offensive that cripples power grids in a third country, prompting that nation to invoke its security treaty with a great power, which then deploys naval forces that encounter a Russian vessel, resulting in an armed confrontation that escalates to the use of tactical nuclear weapons. The interconnectedness of modern systems ensures that a single spark could ignite a conflagration far beyond the original theater, a reality that the Venezuelan crisis has already begun to illustrate. The ultimate outcome will hinge on the capacity of political leaders to recognize the systemic risks inherent in their strategic choices and prioritize long-term stability over short-term victories. History teaches us that great powers have repeatedly underestimated the cost of overextension, and that the most consequential wars have often begun with limited objectives that spiral beyond control. The United States, China, and Russia stand at a crossroads where the path of restraint offers a chance to preserve a degree of order, while the path of relentless competition threatens to unravel the very foundations of the international system that has underpinned global prosperity for decades. As we draw this analysis to a close, the central lesson remains unmistakable. The opening shot over Caracas was not a singular event confined to a single continent. It was a signal flare illuminating the contours of a new era of great power rivalry. The weapons of this era are no longer limited to steel and fire. They encompass code, capital, and the strategic placement of nuclear arsenals. The actors are no longer solely nation-states. They include corporations, cyber collectives, and regional militias whose loyalties are fluid and whose capabilities are expanding at an unprecedented pace. The challenge for policymakers, scholars, and citizens alike is to grapple with this reality before it solidifies into an immutable pattern of conflict. Understanding the intricate web of incentives, the rapid escalation pathways, and the fragile mechanisms that could prevent disaster is the first step toward averting a future where the world teeters on the brink of a multipolar war. The next chapters of this story will be written by the decisions made in boardrooms, war rooms, and legislative chambers across the globe. The stakes could not be higher, and the margin for error is vanishingly small. We will now turn our attention to the specific ways in which the United States can recalibrate its grand strategy to operate effectively within a multipolar framework. This involves re-examining the doctrine of forward deployment, investing in resilient cyber defense architectures, forging deeper economic partnerships that are less vulnerable to coercion, and, perhaps most critically, embracing a diplomatic posture that acknowledges the legitimacy of competing spheres of influence while seeking to establish clear, enforceable norms for competition. By doing so, America may be able to retain a decisive role in global affairs without triggering the cascade of reactions that have become the hallmark of the new strategic environment. Simultaneously, we will explore how China and Russia might adjust their own strategic postures to avoid inadvertent escalation while still pursuing the objectives that drive their rise. This includes a reassessment of the utility of tactical nuclear deployments as a bargaining chip, the development of transparent cyber engagement protocols, and the pursuit of economic diversification strategies that reduce reliance on contentious bilateral relationships. The interplay of these adjustments will shape the contours of the emerging order, determining whether the world moves toward a managed competition or descends into a chaotic scramble for dominance. Finally, we will consider the role of emerging powers and non-aligned states in shaping the dynamics of this multipolar contest. Nations that can act as mediators, provide alternative financial infrastructures, or serve as neutral venues for dialogue possess a unique capacity to influence outcomes. Their participation could prove essential in constructing a lattice of institutions capable of absorbing shocks, diffusing crises, and maintaining a degree of stability in an otherwise volatile system.